Hi, everyone, and welcome to the TLDR for Week 6 Web Exploitation. By the end of this week, you should know about how websites can be weak, including some possible exploits for input fields and why we need to be careful of them, how to use buffer overflows, and how to do setup and configuration on web servers to prevent vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about how to do the setup and why it's important. We are also going to talk a little bit about best practices and some potential issues with website structure. There's a couple of activities in this week as well, most of which are actually relatively safe to do because they are on external websites that are specifically set up for students. So, web exploitation. What we're talking about when we talk about web exploitation is the vulnerabilities that websites have. Most vulnerabilities are found by automated means. It's not just you going and trying things. However, the first couple things that you could try with a website is manipulations that you can do by hand, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. So, for basics, one of the quickest and easiest things that you can do is look at the code for the website. Looking at the code for the website will not only tell you what language it's written in, but it will give you some ideas of how the website was put together. Is it using a framework? Is it using, Bootstrap or WordPress? Was this put together with one of the drag and drop, WYSIWYG type of things? All of that will give you information about how the website is put together so you could figure out where the vulnerabilities are. The next basic thing that you look at is file structure. Can you see the layout of the server? Can you upload files? Can you see files you shouldn't be able to see? So this will actually tie into the URL style of attacks. So when you go to a website and you look at a URL, you can actually see if changing the URL can change what you can see. So if we're looking at, examplewebsite.com, and the URL that you see is examplewebsite.com slash page4.html. Well, if you see that, but none of the other links go to pages 1, 2, and 3, then you could say, I wonder what happens if, and then you can try, example url.com slash page1.html, page2.html, and you can see what else is actually in the server. Sometimes you can actually use that to see if the server is hosting a bunch of files, what the layout is, and that can be one of the back doors into a website that people don't necessarily think about. A slightly more complex one is a get post attack. So if you look at the URL of a website, you can actually see in my example.com, login equals ABC and password equals DCBA and attempts 3. Now, you could actually make changes to that URL and see if that makes any changes to what's happening in the website. So, could you change the login from ABCD to admin? Could you change attempts to 10? And those are some different things that you can do with URL attacks, and then you can also look at the get post attacks, which I have an example from datawookie.netify.com, which is linked in the PowerPoint. And basically what's happening is it's using Chrome developer tools so that you could see what a post style attack looks like. Get and post are the two ways that PHP code is handled. If you don't know what PHP code is or the difference between get and post, it's a really quick Google search because that's actually something that's worth knowing. So, if we look at websites, one of the bigger vulnerabilities is input fields. As soon as you have the ability to interact with people, you have problems. People bring problems. And so, if you have things like special characters or error messages that say too much, so like for example, one of the things that can happen with SQL attacks is sometimes you'll get an error message back And that will actually tell you the names of tables, the user numbers, key fields, and those are all things that you really shouldn't be sharing with people. You can also look at hidden unlinked common pages, hidden unlinked common files, again, going after that URL exploitation. But if you see anything in the website URL that is user equals or search equals, you can actually play with those because that means they're not really hiding them properly. And then you can get extra information that the designer wasn't meaning you to have. It's one of the things that can go wrong with designing websites. Now, the activity is actually hackthisSite.org. And when you register, which is completely free, there's some basic missions. So try a couple basic missions. Think about the basics that we have just talked about in the last 6 minutes. From the last 6 minutes, what do you know how to do? From that, you should be able to actually solve a couple of the basic missions from hackthisSite.org. So that's a really good activity to do. The top 10 weaknesses in websites is coming from OWASP. So the top 10 weaknesses are injection, broken authentication, sensitive data exposure, XML external entities, broken access control, security misconfigurations, cross-site scripting, insecure deserialization, components with known vulnerabilities, and insufficient logging and monitoring. Now, we're going to talk about some examples of why this is a weakness. So, for example, injection. Injection actually means that you are putting information into a form or a text box of a website and you are getting something back that you shouldn't. For example, SQL or SQL. And if you are able to put SQL commands into a text field and have them actually run, that's considered an injection style attack. So if the person making the website didn't sanitize the data properly and pull out some of those, I don't want to say dangerous characters, but sanitize the data properly so that what's coming in is within the expected parameters, that can be a problem. Now, web apps, frameworks, APIs, sometimes they aren't encrypted at all. Sometimes the encryption is done in transit, and that's when we end up having sensitive data exposed. So sometimes APIs are a library basically that you can interact with programming languages, and that's all programming languages, not just web ones. And you can basically ask questions of it. Hey, how do you want this set up? Hey, how do you want that set up? And a framework says, well, here are some samples of things we've already put together. Make changes as you like. Now, because you aren't doing it from scratch, there are some good things. It takes a little bit less time, but if the person doing it didn't take security into account, extra information can be shared. One of the things that we've been seeing more, this is March of 2021. The last, I'd say probably 2 years, is unencrypted AWS buckets and unencrypted databases. If you search for AWS buckets in the news, what you'll actually see is a whole bunch of misconfigured buckets. They're literally just like sections of a server that somebody was putting data into, and in those sections of the server that they are renting, they are hosting, databases, customer information, medical information, and they aren't always requiring a login for you to be able to see it because sometimes people don't necessarily think about what the attackers are going to see, which is, why this is an important class in my view. Um, but if you have an unencrypted database or an unencrypted AWS bucket or a badly configured AWS bucket, you can actually accidentally share gigabytes or terabytes of people's information. There was some issues where a company had uploaded a bunch of medical data to an AWS bucket and they didn't encrypt it at all, so it was just out there and one of the little robots found it. So problems. Now, security misconfigurations. This is a lot harder because if you're doing things like default configs, open storage, misconfigured HTTP heads, verbose error messages, things like that, it's easy to overlook stuff. So, one of the most important things that you can do is checklists and make sure that you're running through the checklist and make sure that you're testing your own sites. So start with the easy stuff, get to the more complex stuff, but it's worth thinking about how things are set up and having a checklist that either you write or start from one that somebody else wrote. I think I've got a couple in the learning module so that you can start to see what you should pay attention to if you're ever creating a website. Cross-site scripting can also be a problem. That's where they are basically taking untrusted data. They aren't validating or updating the page, and it can allow an attacker to run JavaScript on the victim's browser. This can be website redirections, hijacking sessions, defacing websites, and you'll actually see sometimes those will get bundled in ads. So for a little while there, it was really popular for bad advertisers going and paying for ads on websites. Malicious parties came through and they would actually do a redirect where you would get to, you are the 1000th visitor, click here for a free iPhone type of thing. Um, Another issue that happens with websites is known vulnerabilities. There are pieces such as libraries or frameworks that have known vulnerabilities that nobody checked. They didn't even do a quick Google, hey, is this a safe library to use? Hey, is this a good framework? What should I keep in mind for this framework? And if you aren't checking that before you use it, you're leaving yourself open to problems. Not updating or checking on a frequent basis can also lead to known vulnerabilities. If you aren't paying attention to what's happening in the news, you are going to be missing a whole lot of stuff. And yeah, updates are good, patches are good, those are absolutely things we should be doing, but it's also important to pay attention to what's going on in the news so that you know when a new vulnerability has been found, especially if it's a really big one. Now, another thing we'll see is lack of monitoring or lack of logging. So, if you don't see the attacker in the system or get notified when you're compromised, you could be not only leaving yourself open to pivot points, but unknown data breaches. Again, this is being recorded March of 2021. Go look at solar winds. That's all one word. Solar like the sun, winds like the horrendous wind we're having on March 2nd. The solar winds breach and how far reaching that is and how long it actually took for them to realize it was compromised. If you want sort of a little bit of extra, you can also see how they actually threw an intern under the bus for the person whose fault it was for the whole thing. It was a ridiculous PR statement. Now, injection style attacks. SQL injection and cross-site scripting. We can also sometimes see things with like code injection or email injection, and basically the idea is we are taking information and putting it into a website, and the website is not saying, oh no, this is bad information, or oh no, you shouldn't have the permissions to do this. And the website's just going, oh yeah, no, sounds good, I would love to, and then does things it's not supposed to. Now, for SQL injection style attacks, it's important to know a little bit about SQL or structured query language. This is how we communicate with databases. So, using SQL is how we can ask a database for information like, hey, database, please tell me all of the students that are currently registered for my spring classes so that I can email them to remind them that advising is coming up. And so, I could write a SQL query to do that. Now, if the data isn't being sanitized properly, as in I'm writing the query and putting it in on a database, well, one would hopefully assume that I have permissions and access to the database. But if this is just a random website somewhere, which by the way, PS, not legal, don't do this, and you put a SQL query in there, the website should kick back, no, these are not allowed characters. Because there are some specialized characters that you do for SQL queries. But if it doesn't, which still happens, that's considered a SQL injection attack. Now, this is not legal to try on websites you don't own. You can only try this on websites that are specifically built for testing or designed to educate you on SQL injection. This is not a go do this anywhere. This is not legal. This is not a good idea. Only do this on safe sites. Now, the SQL injection, we have a couple different classifications. We can have the sort of classic, see errors you shouldn't, guess what to do. There's a 7 safe video that I linked in the module that you can watch, and that can actually show you what it looks like step by step. There's the blind attacks where you're not seeing error messages or responses. There's database specific attacks where you're actually taking advantage of figuring out the kind of database that's running on the back end. So, like, are they using MongoDB or are they using Oracle? And then you can tailor the attack based on that. You can also do something called an out of band attack. However, that's a lot more uncommon and a little bit more difficult. Stage one is basically, I think that this website that I can legally use because it is specifically there for education is going to be vulnerable to a SQL attack. So I'm going to put some things in, see what happens. Stage two is where I take what I learned from stage one, make some specialized input, and then take advantage of that. Now, there's an example. Guru99.com had a Learn SQL injection with a practical example that was pretty good. There's also a site that was built specifically for education on SQL injections. Your Insecure website, which I still have linked in the lab, although I don't have the lab to go with it. So if it's a website you are setting up in your own virtual machine, you can try that. General internet sites, not legal. Don't do that. Only do it against very specific places. There's 3 links in here that are all safe for you to go read, and if it says try, you can try. I also have a little infographic on how to prevent SQL injections. That is interesting. Now, there are some injection tools in Kali. There are some open source tools, so like, SQL Map, NoSQL Map, things like that. Um, those are the popular ones. I would again like to mention safe websites only. If it's a random website online, it is not safe, it is not okay, and don't do it. Now, if you go to hack.me, that is a safe website. So you can try some basic SQL injections. There was one that I had suggested, but you can try any of them. The whole point of hack.me is a safe place for you to be able to try some of these different activities. Now, cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting means that we're taking scripts that do bad things and putting them into trusted web pages. You can use a web app to send the malicious script. This can be done through web requests. This can be done through dynamic content, such as malicious ads. That's pretty popular. Flash is hopefully finally dead upon dead, but you can do it through Flash, but really any executable code that can happen. Now, you can have malicious code stored on the target server, such as, a database or a message form. You can also have code reflected off of another web server, such as error messages or responses that include some input, and then deliver using email messages. If you click on a bad link, the injected code travels from the website back to your browser. Code was trusted, so the browser executes it. It's one of the things that makes browsers more vulnerable than other things. Now, cross-site scripting vulnerabilities are hard to find because you actually have to review all of the code. You're looking at where the input from the HTTP request could make its way to HTML output, which can be a lot harder to find. Many HTML tags can also transmit bad JavaScript. Nikto and Nessus can scan for some surface vulnerabilities. Nessus is not free, and Nikto, I can't really send you to go use. But OWASP actually has this really great cheat sheet on how to protect against cross-site scripting, and I would recommend that you go read that. Now, if you go to xss-game.appspot.com, then you can try out a cross-site scripting attack, see what it looks like, and that is a safe place to go play with it. Websites and frameworks. Now, these are really popular, especially for people that aren't developers. Third-party templates, Wix, Squarespace. If you watch YouTube, I'm sure you've seen them advertised. If you aren't a full-time developer, think about taking advantage of tools. Everything does have vulnerabilities, but it's more important that you do security basics on a website than to DIY everything. Especially if you aren't a web developer, DIYing your whole site is more likely to be insecure than if you take advantage of things like templates that are out there. Now, that being said, let's say you want to go make a website and you use WordPress. What I would encourage you to do is think about how you're setting up the WordPress, the additions that you're having. So, like if you have the calendar plugin for WordPress, is that safe? Is that secure? Is it being updated? And those are all things that you want to think about as you're creating your website. And the same is for third party templates. How is it being put together? Just do a little bit of basic research, basic recon, so that you can see how things are being put together and how much care people are taking for the security side of things. And if you have concerns, think about if it's really worth it. Is it worth having a calendar on your website if it turns out it hasn't been updated in 15 years? Probably not. Maybe it's worth not having the calendar at all. So you want to think about that when you are, still take advantage of the third party templates, but do a little bit of research, just basics, before you go out and use them. Please let me know if you have any questions.